my comrade in the struggle for another world and another social work, Dr. Vasilios Ioakimidis.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Don, for very generous, really introduction. I'm delighted to be here today. I might have to lower a bit my voice because it's past midnight here in Athens, but I think we will manage. If you hear my neighbors shouting, you know the reason. Would it be okay if I shared my set of slides, my PowerPoint? Good. So it might be useful. Just give me a second. Great. I think you can all see the slides. So once again, I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to be surrounded by this wonderful group of colleagues, students, academics, researchers, members of the public. So thank you so much for inviting me. Don, Professor Martinez, as you've already mentioned, we've been coexisting in academic and political networks in social work for a while now. So thank you also for inviting me in this very timely and very important seminar series in global social work, in what is really an important and impactful series in global social work. I think we will have the opportunity as the discussion moves on to discuss about the current political conjunctures. But I'm sure you will all allow me to speak to begin with, or even focusing a little bit more tonight on the past. I will be focusing a bit on history and the diverse ways our profession dealt with, or as we'll see later on, didn't deal with some of the major and most complex political challenges or conjectures, as I mentioned before. Some of the most complex political episodes of the 20th century, the era of modernity, as the sociologists would describe it. And I would start my presentation with an anecdote, really. In 1921, Walter Benjamin, the renowned philosopher, the Jewish German philosopher who later committed suicide while trying to flee the Nazis, really. So in 1921, he bought Paul Klee's painting, Angelus Novus. This is a famous paint. The expressionist paint depicts the image of an angel. And frankly, that's my own humble opinion, in its lifetime, this paint enjoyed fame rather disproportionate to its slightly modest artistic value. I'm not a critic, really, but this is my view. It was a rather modest artistic value, but its prominence has been primarily linked to Benjamin's essay, the great interpretative essay, thesis on the philosophy of history, a famous essay, really. So in this text, Walter Benjamin compared the Angelus Novus with his very own allegorical, very own cryptic idea of the angel of history. So he created this metaphor. He saw the angel of the paint as the angel of history. And he has written this terrific quote, in my view. He said that the angel turned his face toward the past, and he perceived the chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling records upon records and hurls it in front of his feet. And then he says that the angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But then all of a sudden, a storm is blowing from paradise, He has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. And what he says, he concludes this very interesting paragraph by saying this storm is what we can call progress. It's a terrific idea. Is the idea of the angel of history witnessing catastrophe, misery, oppression, death, and weeping, being very upset, and why he's reflecting on this horrible image. Then there is a storm that pushes him away into the future, but his eyes are still fixed to these horrible incidents. And this is what he called progress, this move towards the future while remembering the past. I thought this was a great metaphor for social work. And the British philosopher Terry Eagleton very eloquently rephrased Benjamin's allegory and using another wonderful quote. He said that what drives men and women to revolt against injustice is not dreams of liberated grandchildren, but memories of enslaved ancestors. So reversing this powerful idea, one could say that the dominant tendency our societies show towards oblivion is a rather guaranteed way to losing control of shaping a better future. In Benjamin's view, future progress comes from confronting the past, no matter how difficult, how traumatizing and fractured it may look. And indeed, our profession, social work, has notoriously failed to recognize the centrality of the angel of history. It has failed to understand history as a way of developing its own ideology, shaping its theory, and forging its practice. Indeed, the profession's emphasis on the here and now practice, at least that's what's happening in Europe, and the whole evidence-based what works mentality has really deprived us from the opportunity to rediscover our past legacies while using these legacies to reimagine our future directions. And indeed, now, as I will be explaining in the next few minutes, our past legacies, as mixed and as contradictory as the social work profession itself. And histories of oppression and histories of catastrophe are really tightly interwoven with wonderful legacies of extraordinarily brave, humane, and wonderfully radical political action. So in a largely ahistorical profession, it is not even it's not easy, or it's not even possible to produce a decent and adequate mapping, let alone a typology, as we try to do in the book, of horrible histories. But for analytical purposes, we have tried to categorize those histories, both in our book and now in this presentation, in some broad interrelated sections. And the first category I'd like to place an emphasis on is really what we call in the book children of the nation, this preoccupation of social work with children and families, and especially in the context of oppressive regimes. Because indeed, looking at the history and practice of our profession, preoccupation with the shaping and evolution of the institution of family has been really central to the history of social work and the social practice. And in capitalist societies, such preoccupation really reflects the desire of the state to ensure the continuation, the perpetuation of working class families as a unit, as we say, a unit of production and consumption. So it was a preoccupation of the state to shape the families the way they wanted they wanted in order to operate in the market economy. And welfare services have been instrumental in this process. This is really what we call in our book and in our research the care and control function of the welfare state. Very often we use the idea of a pendulum, really, and we say that in the 20th century, even nowadays, sometimes our societies move towards the social care element, the more understanding, the more collectivist, and other times they move towards the more controlling function of social, but the two coexist. And sadly, my observation is as we speak, we live through a period where this pendulum has moved towards a controlling function of the profession. Now, the oppressive nature of what I just described of this system has been really well documented in both social work, in social policy primarily, and in sociology. But what we have tried to capture in the book really is not only the contradictory nature of the profession, but we try to understand and highlight examples of notorious brutality informed during periods of extraordinary political events. And undeniably, during the 20th century, the most notorious example one could think, an example of social work complicity to catastrophic practices, has to be inevitably the way social youth and community workers function in the 30s and 40s in Nazi Germany. A good colleague, Walter Lorenz, a European scholar, German scholar, has suggested that in the 30s and 40s, social service staff, as he called social work employees, came directly under state control. And this happened through a false perception of what he calls value neutrality. During a period of extreme violence and extreme ideological and catastrophic oppression, social workers put forward the idea of their profession as being neutral and technocratic, and therefore they didn't have to take a position. They would ignore the political misuse of the profession. So social policy in this context, in Nazi Germany, really had a double purpose. On the one hand, it tried to physically, even physically, and of course socially segregate and exterminate families that the German state considered as unworthy. We're talking about a system of racial hierarchy. You know? So the system was not only about identifying the citizens who would be unworthy of being considered as citizens of the Reich, but they would even try to exterminate them. Of course, the Holocaust is part of this horrendous process. On the other hand, the role of social work at the time focused on educating and reforming the family of the worthy citizens to make sure that they're better educated and they better understand this genealogy of racial hierarchy. So social workers and social pedagogues in Germany and Central European countries, one would see the term as being a synonym, really, social pedagogy. They were really involved in the process of monitoring, reshaping, and indoctrinating children. There was also an emphasis on women. As we see in the history of social work and the oppressive elements of social work, women have always been disproportionately targeted. In that case, young women were expected to exercise, stay healthy, and devote their lives to the infamous in Germany concept of the 3Ks. I don't speak any German, but I'll give it a go. The 3Ks are Kinder, Kirche, which in English is children, cooking, and church. So women were expected to devote their lives to cooking, going to church, and having children, healthy children. And social workers were expected to be facilitating and monitoring this process. And in order to develop this ideological concept of, to make sure that the ideological concept of racial hierarchy was purely understood by young Germans, social workers often facilitated field visits to centers for the detention of people with disabilities. They used them as freak shows. They would take young Germans to these horrible institutions where the disabled people were detained, and they will encourage the German youth to witness the realities of hierarchy, what we said before, firsthand. And at the same time, they would try to reconstruct the Aryan family, focusing on the removal of what they call the defective children from the community. It was segregation, isolation, and as we know from the Holocaust, extermination, physical extermination, killing of people. Unfortunately, the instrumentalization really of racial hierarchy or the eugenics, social engineering, in the context of social services, this kind of intervention, and I'm thinking about the intervention that's beyond ideological, has elements of physical intervention, carried on after the Second World War, sadly. And I'm sure many of you know better from your own research and discussions that up until roughly the 1970s, even in the the US, many social problems and social issues such as poverty, crime, unemployment were considered as largely hereditary and attributed to what they would call policymakers, the inferior underclasses, and therefore they would be treated with practices aiming at preventing those classes from reproducing. So we're talking about physical intervention, and research, very recent research that we have used in our study as well, suggests in some states, most notably in North Carolina, the practice lasted until well into the 70s and 80s, and affected more than 8,000 poor, vulnerable, and minority citizens, affected them permanently by this horrible practice, including, as you understand, sterilization, segregation, and detention. Sadly, social workers were part of this process as they used tools for diagnosis, in inverted commas, diagnosis that would be solely based on very often observations of home environments and school performance, etc. So in many respects, then Nazi Germany offered a blueprint for social work development that was used in other examples. We don't mention Spain's Franco's Spain as an example where the same practice was used. There was a difference in Spain because, unlike Germany, the concept and celebration of race was not as obsessed with the physical appearance, but it primarily focused on really the cultural construction and the social construction of racial and national identity. In the case of Spain, the enemy was not so much the Jewish community or specific minorities, but the emphasis was on socialism and the whole idea of modernity. And in this context, we know that social services, and particularly psychiatric institutions, were central in the effort, in the grotesque effort to, and that's interesting, not to exterminate, but pathologize political opposition. So in Spain, we have a very interesting example where pro-democracy activists were routinely diagnosed as mentally ill, and they were incarcerated in mental health institutions. And there is a very interesting, again, study that I would encourage you to read into this process of pathologization of political activism and pro-democracy activism that lasted up until the 60s and 70s in Spain, and demonstrates how the whole Francoist Spanish psychiatry was constructed on the notion of the intellectual degeneration caused by communist ideas. There's a fantastic book with the title Los Rojos no estaban locos, the Reds were not crazy, and demonstrates how the Spanish way of producing oppressive practices was more on pathologizing political activism rather than exterminating them the ways that in Nazi Germany has happened. But apart from focusing on winning hearts and minds, and as we said before, shaping the nationally pure new Spaniard, welfare services during Franco were actively involved in a terrible chapter in the modern history of the country of Spain. Over a period of about 30 years, from the early 40s, with the end of the Spanish Civil War, up until the 60s, social services were implicated in a very extensive illegal mechanism that was set up by the state, supported by church officials and other public servants, aiming at literally kidnapping children, mostly, as we now know, from left-wing and poor families, and offering those children for illegal adoption to nationally minded, that's nationalist families. So they thought that this would be of a way to weaken left-wing ideology and expand nationally minded families. Similar stories, sadly, have been witnessed and have evolved in other contexts. In Greece, that I know pretty well, after the Civil War, we had a similar practice. In Argentina and Chile, of course, there's very similar cases during dictatorship. Please let me know 5 minutes before conclusion. Let me know, so I'll start wrapping up because I have lost sense of time. So in this context, the development of social work was seen as the soft approach to perpetuating colonial rule, and I'm talking about Chile and Argentina here, through social control and reconfiguration of the socio-cultural institutions. Using another example, focusing on these colonial legacies, the infamous Canada Scoops or the Aboriginal Protection Act in Australia really represent two of the most powerful examples of systematic child removal from Aboriginal or First Nation families with the same focus. This time was not purely political, was not really aiming at eliminating communists, but it was an effort to drastically assimilate indigenous communities.
Vasilios, just to interrupt, I don't know if you're advancing your slides or not, but it's still on the angel slide.
Oh, yeah. I've had very few slides anyway. It was
Okay.
from the Nazi Germany, which I still find shocking, with young people in institutions in Nazi Germany, but that's it. So there's not much by way of PowerPoints here. So could you see, I just moved the slides. Were you able to see that? Or because I had to set, no, yeah. Okay, sorry. I had another set of PowerPoint I was clicking on. So here we are. So I was talking about Canada and Australia, and I was about to mention a quote on the Aboriginal Justice Commission in Canada that identified, and again, there's a powerful quote that very often used that says that social workers and child welfare workers in this context in Canada remove children from their families, they remove children from their communities only because they felt, by they, we mean the practitioners, social practitioners, that the best homes for the children were not Aboriginal homes. Again, the ideal home in their minds would be the one that instills the values and lifestyles which the child welfare system and the child welfare workers were feeling familiar with. White middle-class homes in white middle-class neighborhoods and communities. So within a period, again, of only 10 years, between 90, 71, 90, 81, over 3,400 Aboriginal children were shipped away to adoptive parents in other countries. Of course, the most extensive and sophisticated example of complicity has to be South Africa, in talking about the colonial context. Apartheid, as you all know, a very complex, a very brutal, multi-layered system of segregation that was really designed to physically, politically, and socially exclude non-white populations, and really aimed at maximizing. I mean, we mentioned capitalism before because this has to do with the function of the labor market. So this process aimed at maximizing labor exploitation through the consolidation, of course, of colonial rule. Again, mainstream white South African social work largely accepted these segregationist ideologies. And they accepted this even before the 1948 introduction of the apartheid. Again, our good colleague Linda Smith, who is, we very often meet in the Social Work Action Network and beyond, has developed a wonderful analysis that demonstrates how the origins of social work in South Africa are really found within the forces of racist capitalism. It is important to mention, nevertheless, that in South Africa, like all the examples I used before, and despite the fact that social services as an apparatus were part of a very oppressive colonial system, many social workers, not the majority, but many, a strong current, sided with the ANC, the anti-racist movement. They resisted apartheid. They developed teaching and research focusing on the principles of solidarity. And as I said before, some of us, they're still very active, and they have been able to share their experiences worldwide. For every single example I used, it's important to say that for every single episode of Social Work's Complicity, one can find episodes of resistance, examples of resistance. And another, we don't have much time. I think it's important to refer to, presumably you can see the slide now because I said I was using a different slide set. These two women in our social work profession, at least in Europe, these pioneers, social work pioneers, were not considered as such. they were removed from our textbooks, and no one would mention about the wonderful contribution to the political history of the profession. On the left side is Irina Sendler. Irina Sendler was a Jewish Polish social worker and nurse, and she worked during the Nazi occupation of Poland near the Warsaw Ghetto. Another social worker, it's a wonderful, I have repeated this example several times, and every time I get these goosebumps. When the Nazi state asked her to provide a full list of children within the ghetto, within the neighborhood she worked as a child protection practitioner, immediately she understood, she suspected why. You know, it was a Nazi Germany after all, going after Jewish children. And what she did was she organized an underground illegal network. She manipulated the birth certificate. She forged the birth certificate. She provided false information about the content of the certificate. And she managed to smuggle more than 2,000 children out of the ghetto and into South and North America. We're talking about she saved from the Nazis over 2,000 children. But what's even more fascinating is that Irina Sendler, being a social worker, she considered that the war will finish, and these children will need to reconnect with the histories, with the roots, understand their own life journey, and that they have a right to know about the past. So what she did was that she used jars, and she put the original certificates in the jars and put them into the ground, dug them into the ground. There's a wonderful documentary and a film that I would definitely encourage you to watch. It's called Life in a Jar, and tells the history of how Irina Sendler not only saved thousands of children using these clandestine illegal networks, but she also managed to reconnect them with the families after the war. The colleague on the right is Tyra Edwards, an African-American social worker from Chicago, who, again, a wonderful example of how a social work pioneer who has not been celebrated as such, and it's important to be able to reclaim those radical histories, through her own experience in anti-racist social work in the streets of Chicago, where she personally experienced the segregation and oppression of US politics. She realized that was in the 20s and 40s and 30s. She realized that the civil war that we discussed before in Spain was a war between the Democrats and the fascists. She realized that her struggle in the streets of Chicago was interconnected with the anti-fascist struggle in Europe. And she joined the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and she traveled to Europe, and she fought not with guns, not with weapons. She, as a social worker, she helped develop some very creative projects for children who had lost their parents in democratic Spain near Barcelona. A wonderful example of an anti-racist social work, approximately 60 years before the mainstream profession even thought that they had coined the term. So in our book, we have tried to demystify those histories, both the radical and the histories of complicity. And I'll be finishing now with the three main elements were identified. You know, we try to provide an analysis as to why and when those histories occur. And definitely the reason why we wrote these chapters and we recounted those histories, and especially the histories of oppression, we didn't do this because we wanted to demoralize colleagues. And unless we try to understand the history, then there is this danger, this risk of demoralizing people. But we did this because there is an important common denominator here, which is the politics of social work. And the three main elements, and I'll finish with this term, where these three common denominators that connect all these histories are as follows. I mean, the first one is the neutrality, the technocracy trap, as I said before. Every time social work has attempted to present itself as a purely technical and politically neutral activity, then we, as a profession, in every single case, we ignored the well-being and the human rights of the people we work with, every single time. The second one is very often the default position for many social work organizations, professional organizations, had historically been to prioritize the self-image and the status of the profession. We're an insecure profession, so very often we put forward the status at the expense of the individuals and the communities we're supposed to be working with. And at times when social work felt most insecure about its own knowledge base and its own scientific grounding, it was then that the profession desperately sought refuge to the rigidity of positivism. Either, we said before, the eugenics, this pseudoscience of eugenics, or the biomedical models that nowadays they make this dangerous comeback. And the third one, and I'll finish with this, is the fact that radical and genuinely anti-oppressive social work requires an ability to constantly reassess the political environment. And as we said before, many social workers have been true pioneers in this process. I'm mindful of time, but I wanted to say that recounting our history is really an important opportunity for us to not only reflect the past, but collectively reimagine the future of the profession. And the truth is that another social work, a radical social work movement that focuses on social justice, is not only necessary, is not even an aspiration, is really something that it actually exists. And I think through these series and with the speakers you have invited and the examples you've discussed, you have managed to prove this, that another social work does exist, is already here. And let's make the most of these series of events, of these opportunities to reconnect, to extend our solidarity to radical social workers all over the world, and reimagine not only a fairer profession, but a fairer and a different world. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Wow, thank you so much, Vasilios. There's so much information to unpack. I wish we had another 4 hours with you, although it is 1 a.m. there, so I want to be mindful. I'd like to introduce our first reflector, Melanie Morris, who's a fourth-year PhD candidate at Boston University School of Social Work. Her research explores the structural and social determinants of oral health among Latinos and Latinas in the community.
Hello, hi. Thank you so much for your talk and giving all those examples. I think it's really important to hear. And I think oftentimes when we have to confront our own history, we really think about how we tend to be complicit. And still as a student, I think about how when we are in school, we often talk about this ideal version of what social work will be. We talk about it as we are this benevolent field that is out here to only do good and really confront systems of oppression and be anti-racist and be anti-oppressive. And any buzzword you think you can throw in there, that's what we really aspire to be. Yet then when we go into practice, that's not what we're confronted with. We are confronted with broken and oppressed systems, and oftentimes we become complicit because then you start working in the system. And so my main question and kind of reflection from this is, how do we continuously how do we take this ideal version that we often learn about in school and then bring it into our practice settings when there are implications of losing your job or not being able to really feel the confidence, or and yet not wanting to take the consequence, potentially not wanting to risk anything by kind of confronting these oppressive systems that sometimes pay us and things like that.
Thank you. I guess, Melanie, that's a very important question, and of course a question that links well with what we were discussing before. Indeed, there's very often a discrepancy between expectation and reality, right? And this can lead to cynicism, can lead to alienation, can lead to a situation where social workers become complicit, as we discussed before. Obviously, in the examples we use, there's some very powerful, very inspirational examples of resistance. But as you said, and that's another research we've done, resistance can be risky. People can lose their jobs. Even worse, they can be persecuted, etc. There are examples of social workers who use the discretion, the street level bureaucracy, as we call it in sociology, this professional autonomy to create spaces of micro resistance. I mean, there's this very interesting example in Greece where I'm sure my colleague Teloni Dora mentioned in the past that when the government requested asylum seekers didn't have access to the health system, the national health system. Again, Greek social workers very often they forge documents and they try to be creative, let's say, in manipulating information and making sure that people had access to treatment. Now, this is. I'm not saying that the people should turn illegal, and that's a very, very risky, this micro-resistance, but people can be more powerful when they engage with collective resistance rather than this lone wolf type of approach. So even though there's some powerful examples of this one-person initiative, what we know from history, and Latin America is a wonderful example, the whole reconceptualization and the ethical and political movement in Latin America, in Chile and Brazil, which is a very different approach to what we know in Anglo-American social work, is based on this collective resistance rather than individualized resistance. So I would say that we don't have much time to analyze this, but keeping the element of resistance, but making sure that we expand this into becoming more collective, create networks, connect with colleagues who have share the same ideas, connect with the people we work with and other movements. So that's the best way of engaging with this type of social action.
Thank you, Vasilios. Our next reflector is going to be Kate Hennensberry, a 2014 graduate of our BUSSW online program. And she's worked in many nonprofit settings and roles, including residential home director, foster care, family support. She currently works for Youth Build USA, supporting opportunity youth around the globe through training for program staff in mental health and wellness and trauma-informed care and positive youth development. She is currently a lecturer at BUSSW, teaching classes in both the human behavior and macro department.
Thanks, Dawn, and thank you so much, Professor Ioakimidis, for this presentation. As you were speaking, it was, I was particularly interested and it resonated with me around the discussion of systemic inequality in children and family services, and prompted me to reflect on my own past social work practice experiences with foster care and child welfare agencies and the ongoing reconciliation I have been making with my own complicity in family policing systems. And so I appreciate your amplification of the concept of the care and control function of the welfare state. And as practitioners and advocates, I believe it's one that we need to continue to understand and critically analyze. This exploration of both historical complicity and current practices can be uncomfortable, but a necessary discomfort, I think. And so it is really sparking many conversations that I hope can transform our practice and challenge these systems of oppression. And I hope that by openly discussing these historical and contemporary challenges, we can work towards a future where social work really lives up to these ideals that we set forth around justice, empowerment, and liberation. And so my question is, how can we engage the broader community, including our clients, maybe these colleagues of ours who continue to work in child welfare systems, and other stakeholders in conversations about social work, historical complicity, and future directions?
Excellent, Kate. That's thanks so much for your feedback and reflection. You know, there's a very interesting debate. I am both in the US and Europe and Australia. I'm the editor of the British Journal of Social Work, and one of the most popular articles for the 2023 year round of publication was a paper entitled "The End of Social Work." It was really an article that argued for abolishing social work as an institution altogether. It was very interesting, and I can see why this was popular. And although I personally find some of the arguments that lead to this conclusion, the arguments, not the conclusion, as logical, and I would empathize with them, I still personally think that social work, as we say in the UK. Okay, when we created the Social Work Action Network, we said social work is a profession worth fighting for. But for a social work that is socially justice-based, you know, is a profession that creates communities of resistance. And rightly, you ask the question, okay, how do we do this? Social work alone won't change the world. It has the ability to support and empower families, individuals, communities, but won't change the world alone. That's why I mentioned before that connecting with broader social movements is essential, is a very important aspect. Now, during our practice, creating spaces of peer supervision, non-hierarchical when possible, or using tools. I know that in Boston there's a wonderful methodological tool in working with communities and families called the Liberation Health Model. Provides really opportunities for engaging with families in a way that is supportive, and in this pendulum that we used before, doesn't move towards social controlling. So the methodologies are there, the movements thankfully do exist, although I appreciate that it's a grim period globally. Let's try to connect the dots. So thank you very much. Yeah.
We have our final but wonderful reflector, my wonderful colleague, Dr. Mark Giannino, who is on the faculty at the School of Social Work, where he's a clinical professor. In this capacity, Dr. Giannino teaches a range of courses within the MSW program. His scholarly interests include inclusive pedagogy, social work ethics, LGBTQ, parenthood, and continuing education. Dr. Giannino?
Thank you, Dawn, and thank you so much, Professor Ioakimidis. I was taking so many notes and I have so many questions, but as you were talking, what I reflected on is the famous Faulkner quote that the past isn't dead, it's not even past. And thinking about the current climate is flirting with fascism, and the mainstreaming of fascism within current political systems, it really gave me chills. I think that, kind of speaking from the lens of being a teacher and being in academia for a while, I think that to some extent this idea that somehow Neutrality is apolitical. Neutrality is quite political. And I think that we have been through as a profession, the whole of being enamored of prioritizing the profession, enhancing professional self-image, the biomedical model. And over the course of the last several years, with the help of Don and many other colleagues, we've begun to integrate and take steps to include anti-oppressive practice, including the integration of the liberation health model in our work. I guess the thing that I was thinking about is in our ethics course, we teach harms analysis. We talk to students about the harms that can be done. In fact, we talk to some extent about the eugenics boards of North Carolina and their disgraceful history and the ways in which social workers were complicit in that. And my question is that we cannot forget our history. I think that the current trend toward erasing history, minoritized voices, and the resonances, like, we need to remember that social workers did horrible things. And also to remember these pioneers, the two women you cited, I did not know. So I'm really eager to look them up. I guess the question is what has been your experiences in teaching and in the academy, institutions that move slowly and push back, for which there sometimes could be health consequences, as Melanie had said earlier, for advancing radical theory or embracing our oppressive past. What would be your recommendations for how to weave this into traditional curricula? What's been your experience in doing so, and how receptive or what pushback have you found in your institutions?
Right. I mean, how do I start? As I said before, I teach at the University of West Attica in Athens, and now we're into the 7th week of our institution being occupied by the students who oppose privatization of university education. So the example of Athenian education might not be very representative, because in my experience, this happens I mean, student movements can grow strong in many countries. And what's very interesting is that in most examples of strong student movements I've seen, social work students are almost always involved. And that reminds me of my experience as an admission tutor back in the UK, where I don't know what's the system like in the UK, but we used to interview prospective candidates and students. It was a process that involved interviewing. I had my objections, with the whole process, but it was in over well over 200 interviews in the last few years. I've never encountered a student, I never met a student who came into these interviews, and when we asked the obvious questions, why social work, they said, oh, because I love micromanaging people's lives and messing about families, and never. And this relates to the example we said before about expectation and reality. So our students, they know what they want when they want to study social work, even vaguely sometimes, but they have a clear understanding that this is an ethical, or they want it to be an ethical professional choice. They want it to be an ethical career. They want this to be a social justice and human rights based career. So we, as academics, as educators, I think in our institutions, we're very privileged because we work with students that they do understand these contradictions we mentioned before better than other students, through their practice, through the personal experience. So within the classroom, I think they're wonderful opportunities, and this is what I've seen time and again. But of course, sometimes there's backlash from university administration, and that's not easy. There's no easy way around it. It's what we said about professionals as well, practitioners. And I suspect political martyrdom might not be a solution there. I mean, losing a good radical colleague because they stood up is always inspirational, but what we need here is a movement. And this is how campus-based trade unions play an important role in protecting, defending, and enhancing social work values and social work education. So on the one hand, I'm very optimistic because of my daily encounters with students, and because, as I said before, here in Greece, we're into the 7th week of student protests, very rich protests with multiple events and sit-in and lectures, and I do feel disillusioned by university administrations very often. But again, the way to protect this wonderful work that we do has to be collective and has to be through the work of the trade unions. So thank you very much for a great question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vasilios Ioakimidis. And we send all of our solidarity and support to your students, to social work students who are occupying the university right now and fighting against the privatization. A huge thank you to all of you for coming. Our amazing speaker, Dr. Vasilios Ioakimidis, our insightful reflectors, Melanie Morris, Kate Hensberry, Dr. Mark Giannino, and finally, our amazing behind-the-scenes research assistants and tech support for all of our E&I events, Megan Nisa, Julia D'Angelo, and Marcus Shaw. Julia will now paste the link to the CEU evaluation and quiz. Please note, you will need to access the link at this time. We are not permitted to email you this link at a later date. So please make sure that you can successfully access it now. We will keep this Zoom room open for another minute to ensure that everyone has time to access the link. Let Julia know if you have trouble accessing the link. Again, it will take about 2 weeks for you to receive your CEU certificate. In about 2 or 3 minutes, when we're done, we'll start removing any remaining participants from the Zoom room so that the event organizers can debrief. So in the movement, and I so appreciate, Vasilios, you saying that, don't go this alone, be part of a movement, right? In the movement, we like to say that the path to justice is more like a marathon and not a sprint. Please take good care of yourselves, everyone, because we need all of you to create our new world, our new social work. We hope to see you at our next E&I Speakers event on Thursday, April 25th, when our very own BUSSW, Dr. Darian Williams, will present his research about the intersection of racial and environmental justice. Thank you again. We'll see you in April.